Imagine a book, a thick book, 200 pages long. It is the story of us, the story of anatomically modern human beings, from our first appearance on this planet to the present day. Every page covers 1,000 years. Now open that book and turn to the history you were taught in school. The pyramids of Egypt, the empires of Mesopotamia, the first writing, the first cities, the first kings. Where does all of that begin? Not on page 1, not on page 50, not even on page 100. It begins on page 194. Everything you think of as human history, all of recorded civilization, every name and date in every textbook is crammed into the last 6 pages of a 200-page book. And before that, 194 blank pages, nearly 200,000 years of anatomically modern humans, people with the same brains, the same bodies, the same intelligence as you, living and dreaming and dying and leaving behind, we are told, essentially nothing. Think about how strange that is. For roughly 200,000 years, human beings exactly like us walked this earth. The same capacity for language, the same hands that can carve and build, the same minds that can imagine and plan and invent. And for the overwhelming majority of that time, according to the story we are told, they did almost nothing but chip stone tools and chase animals across the landscape. And then suddenly, in the last few thousand years, in the blink of a cosmic eye, they built everything: agriculture, cities, writing, mathematics, astronomy, empires. Why? Why the wait? Why would a species capable of building the Parthenon and the space shuttle spend 194,000 years doing, apparently, nothing of consequence? What were we doing in all that lost time? And how can we be so sure that we know? This is the great forgotten age, the missing 97% of the human story. And there are those who believe that it was not empty at all, that in those vast, dark, uncounted millennia, other things happened. That human beings, or perhaps other kinds of humans, rose toward sophistication, achieved things we can scarcely imagine, and were then erased so completely by time and catastrophe that we inherited only silence and forgot they had ever existed. What if the story we tell ourselves, the story of a slow, steady climb from caves to cities, is wrong? What if history is not a straight line rising from nothing, but the latest recovery after a long forgetting? What if we are not the first civilization to reach for the stars, but only the first to have forgotten how many came before? You will confront the staggering mathematics of our own deep past. You will meet a serious scientific idea that asks whether we could even detect a lost civilization at all. You will stand before a temple that already broke history once. And you will decide for yourself whether those blank pages are truly empty or whether something has been erased. This is the story of the forgotten age. Welcome. Let us begin with a fact so basic and so strange that once you truly absorb it, you may never see human history the same way again. The fact is this: we have been here in our current form for an astonishingly long time. And for almost all of it, we can see nothing. When scientists speak of anatomically modern humans, they mean people like us, not primitive, shambling ape men, but Homo sapiens, with the same physical form, the same skeletal structure, and crucially, the same brain as any person alive today. And the evidence indicates that anatomically modern humans have existed for something on the order of 200,000 years, or in the range of that figure, with some findings pushing the origins of our species back even further, toward 300,000 years. Let that settle for a moment. For 2,000 centuries, give or take, beings with our exact intellectual hardware have walked this planet. These were not lesser creatures. A baby born 200,000 years ago, raised in the modern world, would, as far as we can tell, be capable of learning to read, to do mathematics, to fly an aircraft, to write poetry. The capacity was there. The full human mind, with all its brilliance, its curiosity, its ingenuity, was present and complete, tens of thousands of years before the first city was ever built. And now consider the other number, recorded history, the history of writing, of cities, of what we conventionally call civilization, goes back only about 5,000 to 6,000 years. The first true writing systems, the first great urban centers, the first states emerge in that relatively recent window. Everything documented, everything with a name and a date, everything in the great sweep of history from ancient Sumer to this very moment fits inside that narrow band of a few thousand years. So here is the arithmetic that should stop us in our tracks. If modern humans have existed for 200,000 years, and civilization is only 6,000 years old, then civilization occupies just 3% of our existence as a species. 97% of the time that intelligent, capable, fully modern human beings have lived on this earth lies before the beginning of recorded history. 97% in shadow. 97% that we are told was essentially uneventful. This is the missing 97%, and the conventional explanation for it is one we have all absorbed, usually without ever questioning it. The explanation is that for all those tens of thousands of years, human beings simply lived as hunter-gatherers, in small bands, technologically static, never building anything permanent, never developing complex society until at last, around 10 to 12,000 years ago, something changed and the long climb toward civilization finally began. And perhaps that is true. It is, without question, the mainstream view, and it rests on real evidence, or rather, on the real absence of evidence for anything else. We do not find ancient cities from 100,000 years ago. We do not find the ruins of Ice Age empires. What we find for most of that vast span are stone tools, hearths, bones, and the scattered traces of small mobile groups. The record, as we have it, looks like a very long, very slow beginning. But here is where the questions start to press in, quietly at first, and then more insistently. Is it really plausible that a creature as restless, as inventive, as relentlessly curious as the human being did essentially nothing new for 190,000 years? We are a species that cannot leave anything alone, that tinkers, experiments, decorates, and improves compulsively. Give a modern human a spare afternoon and they will invent a game, a tool, a story, a better way of doing something. Are we really to believe that for the overwhelming majority of our existence, this same creature generated no lasting complexity whatsoever? And there is a deeper problem, one that strikes at the very way we know what we think we know. Our picture of that deep past is built entirely on what has survived, and on what we have managed to find. But how much would survive across tens of thousands of years, or hundreds of thousands? How much of our own world would endure that long? And how much of the Earth's surface, where ancient people would most likely have lived on the coasts and river valleys and fertile lowlands, has been drowned by rising seas, buried under sediment, or simply never excavated at all? What if the blank pages are blank not because nothing was written on them, but because the writing has been erased, or lies somewhere we have never thought to look? These are the questions that open the door to the forgotten age. And in this documentary, we are going to walk through that door and explore what might lie on the other side. We will begin with the mathematics itself, the sheer staggering scale of the time we cannot see, and why the standard story asks us to believe something genuinely strange. We will then confront a remarkable scientific idea proposed by serious scientists that asks a disturbing question. If an advanced civilization had existed in the deep past, would we even be able to tell? We will meet the Denisovans, a mysterious branch of humanity we only recently discovered, and ask how much more capable they may have been than we assume. We will examine the great anomaly of agriculture and why it seems to appear so suddenly in multiple places, as if remembered rather than invented. We will stand before Göbekli Tepe, a monumental temple complex thousands of years older than the pyramids, that has already forced historians to rewrite what they thought they knew. We will investigate the controversial world of out-of-place artifacts and the claims of suppressed and forbidden datings, weighing the genuine anomalies against the myths. We will hear the universal memory of a lost golden age, preserved in the myths of cultures across the world. And finally, we will confront the boldest idea of all, that we are not the beginning of the human story, but its recovery. That civilization has risen and fallen before, and that we are simply the latest to climb out of the darkness, believing ourselves to be the first. Keep one thing in mind as we go. We are not going to abandon our skepticism. We are going to weigh every claim honestly and give the mainstream explanations their full due, because many of them are strong. But we are also going to allow ourselves to ask the forbidden question, the one that lies at the heart of this entire journey. What really happened in the missing 97%? And are we truly the first or only the first to have forgotten? Let us begin to find out. Numbers this large are difficult for the human mind to truly grasp. We can say 200,000 years, we can write it down, but we cannot easily feel it. So let us slow down and try to make this number real, because within it lies the entire mystery of the forgotten age. Everything depends on genuinely understanding just how much time we are talking about and just how strange the standard story becomes when you hold that time in your mind. Begin with the human generation, a generation. The span from the birth of a parent to the birth of their child is often reckoned at roughly 20 to 25 years. Let us use a round figure and say that 4 generations pass in a century. That means that in a single 1,000 years, roughly 40 generations of human beings live and die. 40 generations in a millennium. Now apply that to the 200,000 years that modern humans have existed. 200,000 years is 200 millennia. At 40 generations per millennium, that is roughly 8,000 generations of anatomically modern human beings. 8,000 generations of people exactly like us, each one born, growing up, living a full human life with all its loves and fears and thoughts and dreams, and then passing away, handing the world to the next. 8,000 generations. Try to picture that chain of human lives stretching back into the darkness. Each link a real person, as vivid and real to themselves as you are to yourself. And of those 8,000 generations, how many belong to what we call history, the recorded era of civilization? Only the last 240 or so. The other 7,760 generations lived and died in the shadow before the first word was ever written down. This is the staggering math, and it is worth dwelling on, because the conventional story asks us to accept something about those 7,700 generations that, when you really examine it, is quite extraordinary. It asks us to believe that for the overwhelming majority of them, essentially nothing of lasting significance changed. That generation after generation, for tens of thousands of years, Human beings lived in fundamentally the same way, with the same simple tools, the same small bands, the same limited horizons, never accumulating, never building, never breaking through. Let us be fair to that conventional story, because it is not absurd and it is not without evidence. For most of human prehistory, the archaeological record genuinely does show a slow pace of change. Stone tool technologies persisted in recognizable forms for immense spans of time. The pace of visible innovation for much of the Paleolithic was undeniably slow by modern standards. There are real reasons for this. Small, scattered populations preserve and transmit innovations poorly because there are simply not enough people and not enough connection between them to build and maintain complex knowledge. A good idea in one small band might die with that band. Without dense populations, without trade networks to spread ideas, without writing to preserve them across generations, progress can stall for a very long time. This is a genuine and powerful argument, and we should respect it. But even granting all of that, something about the sheer scale still refuses to sit comfortably. Because we are not talking about a few thousand years of slow progress. We are talking about 190,000 years. We are talking about a span of time so vast that it is nearly 40 times the length of all recorded history. And in that span, the same creature that, once it finally got going, went from the first farming villages to the moon in a matter of a few thousand years, is said to have made almost no fundamental leaps at all. Consider the contrast, because it is the heart of the puzzle. Look at what human beings accomplished in just the last 6,000 years, the recorded era. In that tiny sliver of our existence, we went from simple agricultural villages to writing, mathematics, monumental architecture, metallurgy, astronomy, philosophy, and eventually to industry, electricity, flight, computers, and spaceflight. 6,000 years. That is the explosive, headlong pace of which the human mind is capable once conditions allow. Now set that against the 190,000 years that came before, in which we are told the same mind achieved comparatively little. The asymmetry is breathtaking. It is as if a runner stood motionless at the starting line for hours, and then, in the final few seconds, sprinted at superhuman speed. Why? What accounts for the difference? The mainstream answer, as we have said, is that certain conditions had to be met before the sprint could begin. The right climate, dense enough populations, the accumulation of a critical mass of knowledge, and that these conditions only came together at the end of the last ice age. In this view, the long silence was not a failure of human capacity, but a matter of circumstances that simply had not yet aligned. And yet the alternative question keeps surfacing, and it is a legitimate one. Is it truly credible that in 190,000 years, across 8,000 generations, across a planet full of restless, intelligent, endlessly inventive human beings, the conditions for civilization never once aligned, not even briefly, not even in one favorable place, at one favorable time? The Earth is vast, and its climate has fluctuated many times across those millennia. There were warm periods before our own. There were fertile regions, rich coastlines, abundant river valleys. Are we to believe that not once, in all that time, in all those places, did human beings begin to build something more, only to have it lost? This is where the missing 97% begins to feel less like an empty stretch of uneventful time, and more like a vast, dark ocean in which almost anything could be hidden. Because here is the crucial point about our knowledge of that era. It is built almost entirely on absence. We say that nothing much happened, but what we really mean is that we have found little evidence that anything happened. And those are not the same statement. Think about what it would actually take for evidence of an ancient episode of sophistication to reach us across 100,000 years or more. The materials would have to survive. The site would have to escape destruction by ice, water, earthquake, and the slow grinding of geological time. It would have to avoid being buried beyond our reach, or drowned beneath a risen sea, or eroded into dust. And then, on top of all that, we would have to happen to find it, to dig in exactly the right place, and to recognize what we had found for what it was. When you consider how many things have to go right for deep antiquity to leave us a legible message, the silence of those 190,000 years starts to look less like proof of emptiness and more like the natural result of time's relentless erasure. We will explore that idea, the sheer difficulty of detecting a lost civilization across deep time, much more deeply in what follows, because it turns out that serious scientists have asked precisely this question, and their answer is genuinely unsettling. But for now, simply hold on to the scale. 8,000 generations, 200,000 years. A span so vast that the whole of recorded history is but a thin, bright line at the very end of a long, dark corridor. Whatever happened in that corridor, we see almost none of it, and the honest truth is that we do not know with anything like certainty what filled it. The conventional story says a long, slow beginning, but the mathematics leaves room for another possibility, that in all that time, the human story may have risen and fallen more than once, and that we, gazing back, see only the flat, featureless surface of a sea beneath which whole worlds may lie drowned. To ask whether that is possible, we must now turn to one of the most fascinating and disciplined thought experiments ever proposed on this question, an idea that came surprisingly not from dreamers, but from working scientists. It is called the Silurian hypothesis. In the year 2018, two scientists published a paper in an academic journal that posed one of the most extraordinary questions ever asked in the study of Earth's history. They were not fringe theorists. They were not conspiracy-minded amateurs. One of them, Gavin Schmidt, is a climate scientist, the director of a major climate research institute. The other, Adam Frank, is an astrophysicist. And the question they asked, in all seriousness, was this: if an advanced industrial civilization had existed on Earth millions of years ago, long before humans, would we be able to find any evidence of it today? The idea has come to be known as the Silurian hypothesis, a name borrowed with a wink from an old science fiction story featuring an ancient race of intelligent reptiles. But let us be absolutely clear about what Schmidt and Frank were and were not claiming. They were not claiming that such a civilization actually existed. They were not saying that intelligent reptiles once ruled the Earth. Their paper was a thought experiment, a disciplined scientific exercise designed to test our assumptions and to sharpen our thinking about how we might detect ancient industrial activity, whether on Earth or on other planets. In fact, part of their motivation was to think about how we might recognize the signs of a vanished civilization on some distant world. But in the course of exploring that question, they stumbled into something genuinely unsettling about our own planet and about the limits of what we can know. And it is this that makes the Silurian hypothesis so relevant to the forgotten age, because their conclusion, stated plainly, was this: the geological record is so incomplete, and the traces of even an advanced civilization would fade so completely over deep time that we might well not be able to detect an industrial civilization that existed many millions of years ago. It could have risen, flourished, and vanished, and left us almost nothing that we would recognize. To understand why, we have to think carefully about a question we rarely consider. What exactly does a civilization leave behind? And how long would those traces actually last? Consider our own civilization. We feel intuitively that we are leaving a permanent, indelible mark on the planet. Our cities of concrete and steel, our roads, our monuments, the sheer physical bulk of everything we have built, it seems inconceivable that all of it could simply vanish. But now stretch the time scale, not 1,000 years, not 10,000. Think in terms of millions of years and ask yourself what would remain. The answer, when you follow the science, is deeply humbling. Over millions of years, the relentless forces of geology grind almost everything to dust. Mountains erode, coastlines are drowned and raised, continents shift. The surface of the earth is constantly being recycled, buried, uplifted, weathered, and destroyed. Our cities, however massive they seem to us, are made of materials that would crumble, corrode, and dissolve over such spans. Concrete degrades, steel rusts to nothing, glass shatters and weathers. Given enough time, our proudest structures would be reduced to thin, ambiguous smears in the rock if they survived at all. And here is the crucial statistical point that Schmidt and Frank emphasized. The fraction of the Earth's surface that becomes fossilized, that is preserved in the geological record at all, is vanishingly small. Most of what lives and is built on this planet leaves no lasting trace whatsoever. It simply vanishes. Think of the dinosaurs. They dominated this planet for over 150 million years, an almost unimaginable span, vastly longer than humans have existed. And yet the total number of near-complete dinosaur skeletons we have recovered is remarkably small. An entire era of giant creatures ruling the earth for 150 million years has left us only a scattering of bones. If the physical remains of countless billions of enormous animals across such a colossal span of time have been reduced to so sparse a record, then what chance would the remains of a relatively brief civilization have across similar depths of time? This is the heart of the unsettling insight. A civilization, even an advanced one, might exist for only a few thousand years, or a few tens of thousands, a mere geological instant. If it existed millions of years ago, the odds that its physical structures would survive to be found today are extraordinarily slim. The buildings would be gone, the artifacts would be gone, the bones might be gone, and what little survived might be so subtle, so ambiguous, that we would not recognize it as the work of intelligence at all. So how, then, might we ever detect such a lost civilization? Schmidt and Frank pointed out that the most enduring traces would not be physical objects at all, but chemical and geological signatures, the subtle marks left in the sediment and the isotopes by industrial activity. Unusual concentrations of certain metals, traces of synthetic materials, changes in the carbon record from the burning of fuels, signs of altered nitrogen from agriculture, evidence of a sudden warming or a mass extinction. These faint fingerprints in the chemistry of the rock might outlast any building. But, and this is the subtle and troubling part, such signals can be genuinely difficult to distinguish from natural events. The Earth's history is punctuated by natural episodes of rapid climate change and chemical upheaval, and telling the fingerprint of a lost industry apart from a natural convulsion would be extraordinarily challenging, especially across millions of years. Now we must keep our footing here and be as honest as Schmidt and Frank themselves were. The Silurian hypothesis is not evidence that a lost civilization existed. It proves nothing of the kind. It is a thought experiment about the limits of detection. And its original focus was on the deep, deep past, millions of years ago, far beyond the span of the human story. It does not claim that there was a pre-human industrial empire, and neither do we. But consider what it does to our confidence. The mainstream account of the forgotten age, of those missing 97% of human history, rests heavily on a single foundation: the absence of evidence. We say that no advanced society existed in the deep past because we have found no trace of one. And the Silurian hypothesis drives a wedge straight into that reasoning, because it demonstrates rigorously that the absence of surviving evidence is exactly what we would expect to find, even if such a society had existed. If a civilization can vanish so completely from the geological record over deep time that even trained scientists might miss it, then how confident can we really be that the blank pages of prehistory are truly blank? And here is where we can bring the idea home into the human timescale, where it becomes even more pointed. Schmidt and Frank were thinking in millions of years, but the forgotten age of human prehistory is a matter of mere tens of thousands of years, or hundreds of thousands. On that shorter scale, some physical traces might indeed survive, which is part of why the mainstream view remains reasonable. And yet the same fundamental problem applies, only softened. Much of the land where ancient humans would most likely have lived, the coasts and the fertile lowlands, has been drowned beneath risen seas or buried under sediment. Vast regions have never been excavated. Organic materials rot, wood decays, and anything not made of the most durable stone tends to disappear within a few thousand years. If a modest but sophisticated human society had risen and fallen 20 or 50 or 100,000 years ago in a place now underwater or unexcavated, how sure can we be that we would have found it? The Silurian hypothesis then does not tell us that the forgotten age was full, but it demolishes any easy confidence that it was empty. It transforms the silence of prehistory from a settled conclusion into an open question. Absence of evidence, it reminds us, is not evidence of absence, especially when the very nature of deep time is to erase the evidence in the first place. And if we cannot simply assume that the deep past was empty, then we are obliged to look more closely at the tantalizing hints that it might not have been. We must examine the traces that do survive, the mysteries that the conventional story struggles to explain. And one of the most intriguing of all concerns, not our own species, but a mysterious cousin of ours, a lost branch of humanity that we discovered only recently, and whose true capabilities we are still struggling to understand. They are called the Denisovans. In the year 2010, in a cave in the mountains of southern Siberia, scientists made a discovery that would quietly rewrite a piece of the human story. In a place called Denisova Cave, from which the discovery would take its name, researchers found a tiny fragment of bone, just a sliver of a finger bone from a young girl who had died there in the deep past. It was an unremarkable-looking scrap. But when scientists extracted and analyzed the ancient DNA locked within it, they found something astonishing. The DNA did not belong to a modern human, nor did it belong to a Neanderthal, the well-known archaic humans of Ice Age Europe. It belonged to a previously unknown kind of human being, an entire branch of humanity, a distinct population of archaic humans that no one had ever known existed. They were named, after the cave, the Denisovans. And here's the truly remarkable thing about their discovery. They were identified not from a skeleton, not from a skull, but essentially from their genome, from the genetic code preserved in a fragment of finger bone. We came to know of an entire lost people in effect from a whisper of DNA. Think about what that means for everything we have been discussing. Here was a whole population of humans, a distinct branch of our family tree that walked the earth for a very long time and of whom we had, until 2010, absolutely no idea. They had left almost no physical trace that we had recognized. If an entire kind of human being could remain completely unknown to science until a chance analysis of a finger bone in 2010, then how confident can we possibly be that we know everything, or even most things, about who lived in the deep past and what they were capable of? As scientists studied the Denisovan genome and compared it with the DNA of people living today, a fascinating and unexpected picture began to emerge. Because it turned out that the Denisovans had not simply vanished without a trace, they live on in us. When modern humans spread across Asia, they encountered the Denisovans, and they interbred with them. And the genetic legacy of those ancient encounters survives in living people today, particularly among the populations of Asia, Melanesia, and Oceania. Some populations in the islands of the Pacific and in Aboriginal Australia carry a notable proportion of Denisovan DNA. A lost branch of humanity thought extinct still flows in the blood of millions of living people. But the story grows more intriguing still, because that surviving Denisovan DNA turns out to have done something remarkable. It appears to have helped modern humans adapt to their environments in powerful ways. The most famous example concerns the high-altitude peoples of Tibet. Living on the Tibetan plateau, at altitudes where the thin air leaves most people gasping and unwell, the Tibetan people carry a genetic adaptation that allows them to thrive in the low oxygen of those great heights. And that very adaptation, scientists discovered, appears to have come from the Denisovans. In the deep past, Denisovans had apparently already adapted to high, harsh environments, and they passed that hard-won genetic gift on to the ancestors of modern Tibetans. The Denisovans, in other words, were not crude, marginal creatures clinging to survival. They possessed sophisticated adaptations to extreme environments, adaptations valuable enough that they helped modern humans conquer some of the most inhospitable places on Earth. And consider the sheer geographical range implied by all of this. The original bone was found in Siberia, yet the genetic legacy of the Denisovans is strongest far away, in Southeast Asia, in New Guinea, in Australia, in the scattered islands of the Pacific. This suggests that the Denisovans, or various populations of them, ranged across an enormous swath of Asia, from the frozen mountains of Siberia to the tropical islands of the southeast. They adapted to freezing high-altitude plateaus and apparently to tropical island environments. This is not the profile of a narrow, limited, primitive people confined to a single niche. It is the profile of a widespread, adaptable, successful kind of human being, occupying a vast range of climates and terrains across one of the largest inhabited regions of the planet. Now, we must be careful and honest here, because this is where established science ends and speculation begins, and we should mark that line clearly. What mainstream science has established is genuinely remarkable. The Denisovans were a real, distinct, widespread, and biologically sophisticated branch of humanity, capable of adapting to extreme environments, who interbred with our ancestors and left a genetic legacy that survives today. That much is solid, evidence-based, and extraordinary in its own right. What science has not established, and what we should not pretend it has, is that the Denisovans built any kind of advanced civilization. We have very few physical remains of them. We do not have their cities because we have no evidence they had any. We are still, in truth, at the very beginning of understanding who they really were. But it is precisely that gap in our knowledge that opens the door to speculation, and it is a tantalizing door. Because here is what we can reasonably say. We discovered the Denisovans only recently, and almost by accident. We know they were widespread, adaptable, and biologically sophisticated. We know they were intelligent enough to survive and thrive across enormously varied and challenging environments for a very long time. And we know that our picture of them is built on an extraordinarily thin scattering of physical evidence, a finger bone, a few teeth, some fragments, from which we have nonetheless reconstructed the existence of an entire lost people. So the question naturally arises, if we know so little about them, and if what little we do know reveals a capable, widespread, adaptable branch of humanity, then how much more might they have achieved than we currently realize? Is it possible that the Denisovans, over the vast span of time they existed, developed forms of culture, knowledge, or capability that we simply have not yet found, and perhaps never will, given how little of them survives? Could there have been, somewhere in their long history, in their tropical islands or their mountain fastnesses, something more sophisticated than a scattering of stone tools, something that has left no trace we have yet recognized? This is where the honest scientist must say, we do not know, and we have no direct evidence for it. And this is where the explorer of the forgotten age must say, but we cannot rule it out. And the very story of the Denisovans, an entire people invisible to us until a decade ago, is a warning against assuming we know the limits of the deep human past. The Denisovans stand as a living proof of a profound truth, that entire branches of humanity, sophisticated and successful, can exist for ages and remain almost completely hidden from us. If one such people could hide in the shadows of prehistory until 2010, waiting to be revealed by a fragment of finger bone, then the shadows of the forgotten age may hold more than we have ever dared to imagine. The Denisovans show us that the cast of characters in the deep human past was larger and stranger than we knew. But the mystery of the forgotten age is not only about who was there, it is about what they did. And there is one particular development, one supposed great leap, that sits at the very center of the conventional story of how civilization began, a leap so sudden and so strange that it has long puzzled those who study it. It is the moment when human beings, after all those tens of thousands of years, suddenly and inexplicably began to farm. Of all the mysteries in the story of how civilization began, none is more central or more quietly puzzling than the origin of agriculture. It is the hinge on which the entire human story is said to turn. Before agriculture, small bands of hunter-gatherers, wandering, foraging, building nothing permanent. After agriculture, settled villages, surplus food, growing populations, and eventually cities, writing, and everything we call civilization. Farming is the foundation. It is the great leap that made all the rest possible. And the strange thing is how suddenly and how mysteriously it seems to appear. Let us set the scene. For the overwhelming majority of human existence, our ancestors lived as hunter-gatherers, and they were extraordinarily good at it. This was not a desperate hand-to-mouth existence. In many environments, hunter-gatherers lived well, with varied diets, considerable leisure, and deep knowledge of their world. They understood plants and animals intimately. They knew the seasons, the migrations, the growth cycles, and crucially, they must have understood for tens of thousands of years the basic fact on which all agriculture rests, that seeds, when planted in the ground, grow into plants. This is not esoteric knowledge. Any people who gather wild plants would observe again and again seeds sprouting where they fell. The fundamental principle of farming would have been obvious to intelligent human beings for a very, very long time. And yet, for tens of thousands of years, they did not farm. And then, suddenly, in the window at the end of the last ice age, roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago, they did. Across the world, human beings began to domesticate plants and animals, to settle down, to till the soil. This transition is so momentous that scholars call it the Neolithic Revolution. And the word revolution is telling because it happened in the grand scale of human history with startling speed. Now here's the first puzzle, and it is a genuine one that has troubled scholars for a long time. Why then? If human beings had understood the principle of planting for tens of thousands of years, why did they wait until that particular moment to act on it? What changed? Why, after 90,000 years or more of not farming, did our ancestors, in a relatively brief window, finally take up the plow? But there is a second puzzle, and it is even stranger, because when we look closely, the adoption of agriculture does not appear to have been an obvious improvement in people's lives, at least not at first. This is one of the great counterintuitive findings of modern research. The evidence suggests that early farmers were often, in important respects, worse off than the hunter-gatherers who preceded them. Studies of ancient skeletons indicate that with the shift to farming, human health in many places actually declined. Early agricultural populations often show signs of poorer nutrition, as varied wild diets gave way to a heavy reliance on a few staple crops. They show more evidence of disease as people crowded together in settlements and lived close to animals and their waste. They often show shorter stature, more dental problems, and harder physical labor. Farming in its early stages frequently meant working longer hours to produce a less varied diet, while being more vulnerable to famine if the harvest failed. Think about how strange this is. We are asked to believe that human beings who had thrived as hunter-gatherers for tens of thousands of years, who understood perfectly well how to feed themselves, voluntarily abandoned a successful way of life for one that made them by many measures sicker, shorter, and more overworked. Why would they do that? Why make a change that, in the short term, seems to have made life harder and less healthy? This is a real and well-recognized puzzle in the study of human prehistory, and mainstream scholars have proposed a number of serious answers to it. Some point to climate change at the end of the Ice Age, arguing that shifting conditions made wild resources less reliable and pushed people toward cultivation out of necessity. Some point to population pressure, suggesting that growing numbers of people forced the adoption of more intensive food production, whatever its costs. Some argue that farming, despite its downsides for individual health, allowed populations to grow larger, and that sheer numbers, not individual well-being, drove its spread. Some emphasize that once you start down the path of farming and your population grows dependent on it, there is no going back. These are thoughtful and evidence-based explanations, and we should give them their due. The mainstream does not ignore the puzzle of agriculture. It wrestles with it seriously, but there is another way of looking at all of this, one that connects directly to our exploration of the forgotten age, and it is worth considering carefully. What if agriculture did not appear suddenly because it was suddenly invented? What if it appeared suddenly because it was remembered? What if the knowledge of farming or the impulse toward it was not a brand new discovery at the end of the Ice Age, but the recovery of something known before and lost? Consider how this reframes the puzzle. If, in the deep past, in the forgotten age, Human beings, or some human beings, had already developed agriculture and settled life, and if that world had then been swept away by catastrophe, by the upheavals at the end of the Ice Age, by the drowning of coastlines, by the resets we have explored, then the survivors might have carried with them a memory, a tradition, a fragment of knowledge. And when conditions stabilized, that knowledge might have reasserted itself, spreading again across the world as people rebuilt. In this view, the Neolithic Revolution was not humanity's first steps into farming, but its return to a practice it had known before and lost. Not an invention, but a recovery. And there is one feature of the origin of agriculture that this idea illuminates in a striking way. Agriculture did not appear in only one place. It appears to have arisen independently, in multiple separate regions of the world, within a relatively narrow window of time. Farming emerged in the Near East, but also, apparently independently, in parts of East Asia, in the Americas, in New Guinea, and elsewhere. Different crops, different animals, different peoples, in different parts of the globe, all making the same fundamental transition to agriculture at roughly the same broad period in the human story. The mainstream explanation for this is that the end of the Ice Age brought global changes in climate that made agriculture viable and even favorable in many regions at once, so that different peoples independently responded to similar new conditions. This is a reasonable and likely explanation, and we should acknowledge its strength. But those drawn to the idea of a forgotten age see in this global, near-simultaneous emergence something more suggestive. Why should so many separate peoples across the whole world all cross the same threshold at roughly the same time after tens of thousands of years of not doing so? Could it be, they ask, that they were all drawing on a shared inheritance, a common memory or tradition of a practice that had existed before the Great Forgetting, now resurfacing across the world as humanity recovered? We must be clear, as always, that this is speculation, and that the mainstream explanations, climate change, population pressure, independent adaptation, are serious and may well be sufficient. There is no direct evidence of a pre-Ice Age farming civilization, and we should not pretend otherwise. But the puzzle itself is real. The suddenness is real. The counterintuitive early hardship of farming is real. The near-simultaneous global emergence is real. And these genuine features of the agricultural transition are, at the very least, consistent with the possibility that we are looking not at a beginning, but at a recovery. If human beings were recovering lost knowledge as the Ice Age ended, then we might expect to find somewhere in the record evidence of sophistication appearing too early, too suddenly, too fully formed to fit the story of a slow, fumbling first attempt at civilization. We might expect to find something built by supposed hunter-gatherers that they should not, according to the conventional timeline, have been able to build at all. And, remarkably, we do. On a hilltop in modern Turkey, there stands a monument that has already forced archaeologists to tear up their assumptions and rewrite the story of how civilization began. It is called Göbekli Tepe. On a dusty hilltop in southeastern Turkey, not far from the border with Syria, there is a place that has done something almost no archaeological site has ever done. It has forced the experts, the mainstream, cautious, credentialed experts, to admit that they were wrong about the very foundations of civilization. It is not a fringe theory. It is not a speculative claim. It is a real, excavated, scientifically dated site, and what it reveals is so startling that it has reshaped the story of how human civilization began. Its name is Göbekli Tepe. The name means, roughly, Potbelly Hill. And for a long time, that unassuming mound of earth attracted little attention. But beneath it lay one of the most important discoveries in the history of archaeology. When excavations revealed what was buried there, the findings were almost impossible to believe. For under that hill stood a complex of monumental architecture, great rings of massive stone pillars, many of them enormous, some standing several meters tall and weighing many tons. These were not rough, crude stones. They were carefully shaped, standing pillars, many of them beautifully carved with intricate relief images of animals, foxes, boars, snakes, birds, scorpions, and other creatures rendered with real artistry. Arranged in deliberate circular enclosures, these T-shaped pillars formed what appears to be a monumental ceremonial or religious complex, a temple built on a scale and with a sophistication that took the world's breath away. And then came the dating, and the dating is what broke history. Göbekli Tepe is old, almost unbelievably old. The site dates back approximately 11,500 years, and possibly more, to around 9 or 10,000 years before the Common Era. Let us put that in perspective, because the perspective is staggering. Göbekli Tepe is older than the pyramids of Egypt by some 6,000 years. It is older than Stonehenge by roughly 6,000 years. It is older than the invention of writing. It is older than the wheel. It is older than metal tools. It is older, in fact, than almost everything we associate with civilization. It was built at the very end of the last ice age, in a period when, according to the conventional story, human beings were still simple hunter-gatherers who had not yet even invented agriculture. And that is precisely the problem. That is what makes Göbekli Tepe so revolutionary and so unsettling. Because according to everything historians and archaeologists long believed, this site should not exist. The conventional model of how civilization arose went like this. First, human beings invented agriculture. Farming produced surplus food. Surplus food allowed populations to settle down and grow. Settled, growing populations developed social hierarchies, specialized labor, and organization. And only then, once you had settled agricultural societies with surplus and organization, could you get monumental architecture, the great temples and monuments that require large numbers of people working together, directed toward a common purpose, and fed by a food surplus while they labored. Agriculture first, then settlement, then, much later, monuments. That was the order. That was the story. Farming was the foundation on which everything else was built. Göbekli Tepe shatters that sequence. Because Göbekli Tepe was built by hunter-gatherers, it was constructed before the advent of agriculture in the region by people who, as far as the evidence shows, were still living primarily by hunting wild animals and gathering wild plants. The very people who, according to the old model, could not possibly have built such a thing because they lacked the agriculture, the surplus, and the settled organization supposedly required, went ahead and built it anyway. A monumental, sophisticated, artistically carved stone temple complex raised by people who had not yet invented farming. Think about what this means. To quarry, shape, transport, and erect massive stone pillars, some weighing many tons, and to carve them with intricate art requires an enormous investment of coordinated human labor. It requires planning. It requires organization. It requires the ability to gather and direct and feed large numbers of workers over a sustained period. According to the old model, hunter-gatherers simply could not do this. They lacked the surplus, the numbers, the social complexity. And yet, here is the undeniable, excavated, radiocarbon-dated proof that they did. Göbekli Tepe stands as physical, irrefutable evidence that human beings, before agriculture, before cities, before everything we thought was required, were capable of monumental achievement. And it goes further because Göbekli Tepe may actually reverse the old story entirely. Some researchers have proposed, based on the site, that it was not agriculture that led to monument building, but perhaps the reverse, that the desire to build and maintain great ceremonial centers like Göbekli Tepe, to gather large numbers of people together for religious or social purposes, may have been part of what drove human beings toward agriculture in the first place, in order to feed the crowds that such projects required. In this radical reinterpretation, it was not that farming created civilization and religion. It may be that the impulse toward monumental, communal, perhaps religious activity came first and helped give birth to farming. The temple before the farm. This would overturn one of the most basic assumptions about how it all began. Now, what does Göbekli Tepe prove, and what does it not prove? Let us be careful and precise, because the site is often invoked loosely, and it deserves accuracy. Göbekli Tepe does not prove that there was a lost advanced civilization with metal tools and electricity in the deep past. It does not prove the existence of Atlantis. It is not in itself evidence of a technologically advanced, forgotten world. The people who built it still used stone tools. It is a Stone Age site, however remarkable. We should not overstate what it shows. But what it does prove is profound, and it strikes directly at the heart of our investigation. It proves that our confident assumptions about the capabilities of prehistoric people were wrong. It proves that human beings, thousands of years earlier than the conventional story allowed, possessed the organization, the ambition, the artistry, and the capability to create monumental works. It proves that sophistication and complexity existed before the point at which mainstream history had placed their beginning. It proves that the neat, tidy sequence of how civilization arose was, at the very least, incomplete, and in important ways simply mistaken. In short, Göbekli Tepe proves that we underestimated the deep human past. And if we underestimated it here so dramatically, on this one hilltop, then where else might we have underestimated it? That is the true significance of Göbekli Tepe for the forgotten age. It is a documented, mainstream accepted case in which the capabilities of prehistoric humans turned out to be vastly greater than anyone had believed. It is proof of concept that the deep past can hold sophistication we did not expect, and it should make us humble and cautious before we declare with confidence that nothing of consequence happened in all those tens of thousands of years before recorded history. And here is a final tantalizing detail. Göbekli Tepe was, at some point, deliberately buried. The people who used it appear to have intentionally covered the great enclosures with earth, entombing them, which is part of why they survived so well. Why they did this remains a genuine mystery, and there is more. Only a portion of the site has been excavated. Much of Göbekli Tepe and other related sites nearby still lies underground, unexplored, waiting. If a single hilltop can rewrite the story of civilization, what might still be sleeping beneath the earth, undated and undiscovered, at Göbekli Tepe and at 1,000 other sites we have not yet touched? Göbekli Tepe is solid ground. It is real, and its implications are accepted. But the exploration of the forgotten age also ventures onto more contested terrain, into the realm of objects and artifacts that seem to some to appear in the wrong place or the wrong time entirely. These are the so-called out-of-place artifacts, and they demand to be examined with both an open mind and a careful, critical eye. We now step onto more treacherous ground. For the exploration of the forgotten age inevitably leads to a category of claims that is exciting, controversial, and, it must be said, deeply mixed in its reliability. These are the so-called out-of-place artifacts, objects that, according to those who champion them, appear in the wrong layer of time. Objects that seem too advanced, too refined, or too strange for the era in which they were supposedly found. To some, they are the smoking guns of a lost civilization. To skeptics, they are a catalogue of errors, misunderstandings, and outright hoaxes. And the honest truth is that both are partly right, which is exactly why we must approach this subject with an open mind and a sharp critical eye at the same time. The basic idea of an out-of-place artifact is simple and provocative. If an advanced civilization existed in the deep past, then perhaps here and there, an object from that lost world might survive and might be found embedded in rock or sediment far older than it should be, or crafted with a sophistication that the supposed period could not have produced. Such an object, if genuine, would be a physical message from the forgotten age, a fragment of a world that history has erased. And so, for a long time, enthusiasts have collected reports of such anomalies, objects that seem to defy the accepted timeline. Let us consider the kinds of claims that arise, and then let us apply the discipline that this subject desperately requires. There are reports from the 19th and 20th centuries of manufactured-looking objects allegedly found inside solid rock or coal that is supposedly millions of years old. The reasoning offered is striking. If a metal object, something that appears deliberately made, is truly encased in rock that formed hundreds of millions of years ago, then it could not have been made by any known civilization and would imply an intelligent maker in the unimaginably deep past. There are reports of strange metallic objects of curious shape and precision said to have been unearthed from ancient deposits. There are accounts of markings that look like tracks or impressions in very old stone. And there are famous individual objects that have become icons of this genre, endlessly discussed and debated. Now, here is where we must be rigorous, because this is precisely the kind of subject where the human desire to believe can overwhelm careful judgment. When these claims are examined closely by careful investigators, the great majority of them dissolve, and they dissolve for a variety of well-understood reasons, which we owe it to the truth to lay out plainly. First, there is misidentification. Nature is a superb craftsman, and it produces all on its own objects of startling regularity and apparent design. There are natural mineral formations called concretions that can form remarkably smooth spheres, disks, and other geometric shapes entirely without any human involvement. Time and again, an object hailed as an impossible ancient artifact has turned out, on expert examination, to be a perfectly natural geological formation that merely looks manufactured to an untrained eye. Our pattern-seeking minds, so eager to find design, are easily fooled by the accidental artistry of geology. Second, there is the problem of context and provenance. In archaeology, an object means little without a reliable, documented record of exactly where it was found, in what layer, under what conditions, verified by careful excavation. Many of the famous out-of-place artifacts come with no such reliable record. They were reportedly found long ago by people without archaeological training in circumstances that were never properly documented or independently verified. An object said to have been discovered inside ancient coal decades ago with no rigorous record of the find simply cannot bear the weight of the extraordinary claim placed upon it. Without secure context, An anomaly is just a story. Third, there is the simple matter of intrusion. Objects can find their way into older layers by entirely mundane means. Something can fall into a crack, be buried in a hole, be washed into a deposit, or be introduced by natural disturbance so that a genuinely recent object ends up physically located within much older material without any mystery at all. What looks like an artifact embedded in ancient rock may be a far more recent object that simply came to rest there. And fourth, regrettably, there is fraud. The world of anomalous artifacts has, over the years, attracted hoaxes, deliberately manufactured objects planted or fabricated to deceive, to entertain, or to profit. Not every claim is made in good faith, and some famous cases have been exposed as outright fakes. So when we apply this rigorous lens, the vast majority of celebrated out-of-place artifacts fall away. They turn out to be natural formations or poorly documented finds or intrusions or hoaxes. This is the honest, sober reality, and anyone who tells you that these objects constitute clear, abundant proof of a lost civilization is not being straight with you. Intellectual honesty demands that we acknowledge this plainly. And yet, having cleared away the false, the mistaken, and the fraudulent, we are left with a subtler and more interesting question. Does the failure of most claims mean that every anomaly, everywhere, has been satisfactorily explained? Or do there remain, in the vast global record of finds, a small number of genuinely puzzling cases that resist easy explanation, objects whose context seems reasonably documented, whose nature seems difficult to account for, and which continue to nag at the edges of the accepted picture? The champions of the forgotten age argue that there are such residual cases, and that the mainstream is too quick to lump the genuinely puzzling in with the obviously bogus, dismissing the whole category with a wave of the hand. Here, we must hold two truths together without collapsing into either credulity or closed-minded dismissal. The first truth is that most out-of-place artifacts are not what they are claimed to be and do not constitute good evidence of anything. The second truth is that the general principle that a genuine anomaly, if properly documented and verified, would be enormously significant, remains valid. The problem is not that anomalies are impossible. The problem is that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and the great majority of these particular claims simply do not meet that standard. But let us think about what a genuine out-of-place artifact would and would not prove, even in the best case. Suppose, for the sake of argument, that a single, well-documented, genuinely anomalous object were found, something manufactured in a securely dated ancient context that could not be explained by natural processes, intrusion, or fraud. What would it show? It would show that someone or something capable of manufacture existed at that time. It would be a profound and revolutionary discovery, but it would not by itself tell us who they were, how advanced they were, or what kind of society they had. A single artifact is a tantalizing fragment, not a full picture. It would open a door, but it would not show us the room beyond. And this points to a deeper truth about the search for the forgotten age. The strongest case does not rest on any single spectacular object, on any one supposed impossible artifact. The dubious individual claims are, frankly, the weakest part of the whole inquiry, and to lean on them is to build on sand. The strongest case, rather, rests on the broader, more disciplined evidence we have been examining. The staggering mathematics of deep time, the humbling logic of the Silurian hypothesis, the recent discovery of the Denisovans, the genuine puzzle of agriculture, and the rock-solid, mainstream accepted revelation of Göbekli Tepe. These are far more powerful than any dusty object of doubtful provenance. Still, the world of anomalous artifacts leads us to a related and darker claim, one that shifts the question from the objects themselves to the way our institutions respond to them. The champions of the forgotten age argue that it is not only that anomalies are dismissed, but that inconvenient evidence, including anomalous dates that challenge the accepted timeline, is sometimes actively suppressed, buried, or explained away, not because it is wrong, but because it is threatening. This is the charge of forbidden history, of suppressed datings, and it deserves careful and balanced examination. Here we come to one of the most provocative and emotionally charged claims in the entire exploration of the forgotten age. It is the claim that the truth about our deep past is not merely lost or eroded by time, but actively hidden. That inconvenient evidence, discoveries that would overturn the accepted story of human history, has been suppressed, buried, ignored, or explained away, not because that evidence is genuinely flawed, but because it threatens the established order of knowledge. This is the idea of forbidden history, of suppressed datings, and it is a claim we must handle with particular care, because it contains, tangled together, both a genuine and important insight and a tempting and dangerous overreach. Let us begin with the strong version of the claim, as its proponents make it. They argue that over the decades there have been numerous discoveries, anomalous dates, artifacts, and findings that seem to place human beings or human activity or human sophistication far earlier than the accepted timeline permits. And they argue that rather than being embraced and investigated, these findings were rejected out of hand, kept out of the textbooks, denied funding and attention, and effectively erased from the story because they did not fit the reigning consensus. In this view, there is an orthodoxy in mainstream archaeology and history, a set of accepted beliefs about when and how human civilization arose, and any evidence that contradicts that orthodoxy is treated not as a fascinating anomaly to be explored, but as a threat to be neutralized. The gatekeepers of knowledge, the argument goes, protect the established paradigm, and inconvenient truths are quietly buried. Now, before we rush to judge this claim, we must acknowledge something genuinely true and important that lies at its core, because the history of science really does show that established paradigms resist evidence that challenges them. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a well-documented feature of how human knowledge actually works. Scientists are human beings, embedded in institutions, invested in the theories they have built their careers upon. When a new piece of evidence arrives that contradicts the accepted framework, the natural and often reasonable first response is skepticism. The evidence is questioned, scrutinized, and frequently rejected, at least at first. And history is full of cases where a revolutionary idea, later proven correct, was initially dismissed, ridiculed, or ignored by the establishment of its day. The very story of Göbekli Tepe, which we examined earlier, is a case in point. The idea that hunter-gatherers could build monumental architecture was, before the excavations, considered essentially impossible, and would surely have been dismissed had someone merely proposed it without the undeniable stones to prove it. So there is real substance to the underlying observation. Scientific paradigms are conservative. They resist change. Evidence that breaks the accepted model faces a steep uphill battle for acceptance. And some genuinely valid findings have, throughout history, been neglected or resisted for a time because they did not fit. This is a legitimate and important insight into how knowledge advances, often slowly and against institutional inertia. But now we must apply the balancing discipline, because the strong version of the suppression claim goes much further than this reasonable observation, and in doing so, it often overreaches badly. First, there is a crucial difference between evidence being resisted and evidence being suppressed in some deliberate, coordinated way. Institutional caution and paradigm defense are real, but they are not the same as a conscious conspiracy to hide the truth. The reason most anomalous claims are rejected is usually not that shadowy authorities are protecting a secret, but that, as we saw with out-of-place artifacts, the claims genuinely do not hold up under scrutiny. Poor documentation, unreliable context, questionable dating methods, and simpler explanations account for the dismissal of most such findings. To interpret this ordinary, if imperfect, process of scientific filtering as deliberate suppression is, in most cases, a significant misreading. Second, we must remember that science, for all its conservatism, does change, and sometimes dramatically. Paradigms do fall. The story of Göbekli Tepe again illustrates this. When the evidence was undeniable, properly excavated, securely dated, rigorously documented, the mainstream did not suppress it. It absorbed it and rewrote the textbooks accordingly. The accepted date for the earliest monumental architecture was pushed back by thousands of years, not by rebels working outside the system, but by mainstream archaeology itself, following the evidence. This shows that the system, though slow and often resistant, is not a sealed vault. Sufficiently strong, well-documented evidence does eventually force change. If there were truly compelling, rigorously documented evidence of a lost, advanced civilization, the history of science suggests it would eventually break through. Third, the strong suppression narrative often relies on precisely the weakest evidence, the dubious artifacts, the poorly documented finds, the anomalous dates that turned out, on examination, to have mundane explanations. When a questionable date is set aside because the sample was contaminated, or the method was misapplied, or the context was unreliable, that is not suppression. That is quality control. It is the ordinary, necessary work of separating reliable findings from unreliable ones. To recast every such rejection as the burying of forbidden truth is to misunderstand or misrepresent how careful dating actually works. So where does the balanced truth lie? It lies, as it so often does, in the middle, and it requires us to hold a nuanced position rather than a simple one. On one hand, we should firmly reject the melodramatic vision of a vast, deliberate conspiracy of scientists coordinating to hide the true history of humanity. There is no good evidence for such a thing, and it does not match how the messy, competitive, publication-hungry world of academia actually functions, where overturning a major theory is, in fact, a path to fame, not ruin. Any scientist who could genuinely prove a lost civilization would be celebrated, not silenced. On the other hand, we should equally reject the naive and complacent belief that our current understanding of the deep past is complete, settled, and free of institutional bias. It is not. Paradigms do shape what questions get asked, what evidence gets taken seriously, what sites get funded and excavated, and what findings get attention. Genuine caution can shade into genuine closed-mindedness. The line between healthy skepticism, which rightly demands strong evidence, and premature dismissal, which wrongly forecloses inquiry, is real, and it is not always easy to see which side of it a given judgment falls on. And it is entirely possible that valid anomalies, real clues to the forgotten age, have been set aside not through conspiracy, but through the ordinary human tendency to ignore what does not fit, to leave the puzzling find in a drawer, to decline to investigate the site that promises only professional embarrassment. This is the honest, balanced position, not forbidden history hidden by a cabal, but a deep past whose full exploration is shaped and sometimes constrained by the assumptions and incentives of the present. The evidence of the forgotten age, if it exists, may not be locked in a secret vault. It may simply be lying unexamined, undated, unexcavated, or unrecognized, dismissed too quickly, or never looked for at all, because we already believe we know what we will find. And that brings us to a very different kind of evidence, one that no institution could suppress even if it wished to, because it is not buried in the ground at all. It is carried in the collective memory of humanity itself, preserved in the myths and traditions of cultures all across the world. For there is a story that our ancestors told again and again in every corner of the earth. A story of a lost age of greatness, a golden age now vanished from which humanity has fallen. And we must ask what memory, if any, lies behind it. There is a story that humanity has never stopped telling. It appears in the myths of the ancient Greeks and the sacred texts of India. It echoes in the traditions of the Middle East, of China, of the Americas, of cultures scattered across every inhabited continent. It is a story so widespread, so persistent, and so emotionally powerful that it seems woven into the very fabric of the human imagination. It is the story of a lost golden age, a time long ago when the world was better, when human beings were greater, wiser, and closer to the divine, and from which we have since fallen. And we must ask a simple, haunting question about it. Why does everyone remember the same thing? Let us begin by surveying just how universal this memory is, because its sheer ubiquity is the heart of the matter. The ancient Greeks told it perhaps most explicitly. In their tradition, preserved by early poets, human history was divided into a succession of ages, and the first of these was a golden age, a time of peace, abundance, and harmony, when human beings lived like the gods, free from toil and sorrow, and the earth gave its fruits freely. After the Golden Age came a Silver Age, lesser than the first, then a Bronze Age, harsher still, and finally the present age, the Iron Age, the hardest and most degraded of all, full of labor, strife, and suffering. The story is unmistakably one of decline, of a fall from an original state of greatness down through progressively lesser ages to the diminished present. The best was at the beginning, and it was lost. Travel east to India, and we find, as we explored when discussing the great cycles of catastrophe, the doctrine of the Yugas, which tells a strikingly similar story. There too, the first age is the age of truth and perfection, when humanity is virtuous, wise, and long-lived. And there too, the ages that follow represent a progressive decline, down to the present dark age, the Kali Yuga, the worst of them all. Once again, a golden beginning and a fall. Look to the traditions of the ancient Near East, and we find memories of a paradisiacal original state, a garden of abundance and innocence from which humanity was cast out or fell away, losing an original closeness to the divine and an original ease of existence. Look across the world to culture after culture, and the same essential theme recurs with remarkable persistence, that there was once a better time, a former age of greatness, harmony, or divine favor, and that the present is a diminished, fallen condition, a shadow of what once was. Now, layered onto this near-universal memory of a lost golden age is another closely related and equally widespread motif, It is the memory of divine or semi-divine beings, culture bringers, who, in the deep past, gave humanity the fundamental arts of civilization. Across many cultures, we find the same striking idea that human beings did not invent the essential foundations of civilized life on their own, but were taught them by gods or by wise beings or by mysterious strangers who came among them in the distant past. In tradition after tradition, there are figures who bestowed upon humanity the knowledge of agriculture, of writing, of law, of mathematics, of astronomy, of the crafts and the arts. Civilization in these stories was not slowly invented. It was given, handed down, taught by someone who already possessed it. Consider how curious this is. Why should so many cultures independently tell the same story, not of gradually figuring out farming and writing and law through trial and error, but of receiving them ready-made from some wiser source? Why is the memory not one of invention, but of inheritance? And here is where these ancient traditions connect directly and provocatively to everything we have been exploring in this journey. Because those who study the forgotten age look at this near universal memory of a lost golden age and of divine teachers who gave humanity the arts of civilization, and they ask, what if this is not mere fantasy? What if these myths are not arbitrary inventions, but the distorted, mythologized memory of something real? What if humanity remembers a lost age of greatness because there actually was one? What if the culture bringers, the beings who taught agriculture and writing and law, are the mythologized memory of the survivors of a lost civilization who brought the remnants of their knowledge to the peoples of the recovering world? This is the interpretation that ties the Golden Age myths to the idea of the forgotten age. In this view, the story unfolds as follows. In the deep past, a sophisticated culture or cultures arose and flourished, an age that later peoples would remember as golden. Then came catastrophe, the resets and upheavals we have explored, the drowning of coastlines, the convulsions at the end of the Ice Age, and that world was destroyed. But some survived, and these survivors, carrying fragments of the lost knowledge, moved among the scattered peoples of the world, teaching them what they remembered: agriculture, writing, the measurement of the heavens. To the peoples they taught, these survivors would have seemed like gods or God-sent teachers, bearers of miraculous knowledge from a vanished world. And across the generations, the memory of that lost age of greatness and of those who carried its knowledge forward was preserved in myth as the Golden Age and as the divine culture bringers, even after the true history had been forgotten. It is a compelling and evocative interpretation, and it would neatly explain the puzzle of agriculture appearing suddenly and fully formed, as if remembered, and the puzzle of civilization's foundations seeming in myth to be gifts rather than inventions. But we must, as always, apply the balancing discipline and consider the sober alternative, which is genuinely strong. The mainstream interpretation of Golden Age myths does not see them as historical memory at all, but as psychological and social expressions, and there is real force to this reading. Human beings, this view points out, have a deep and perennial tendency to idealize the past. Every generation tends to feel that things were better in some former time, that the present is fallen or corrupt compared to the days of the ancestors. This is a nearly universal feature of the human psyche, and it requires no lost civilization to explain it. The myth of a golden age in this reading is not a memory of a real lost world, but a projection of human longing, a way of expressing dissatisfaction with the hardships of the present by imagining a better past. Similarly, the culture bringer myths may reflect the human tendency to attribute great and foundational achievements to divine or heroic figures, rather than to the slow, anonymous, collective labor by which such things were actually developed. It is more satisfying and more memorable to say that a god gave us writing than to say that it emerged gradually from centuries of accounting marks. These are serious explanations, and they may well be sufficient. The universality of the Golden Age myth might simply reflect the universality of human nature, our shared tendency to romanticize the past and to mythologize the origins of our institutions. We should not pretend that the myths are proof of a lost civilization. They are not. And yet, when we set these myths alongside everything else we have examined, the staggering mathematics of deep time, the humbling logic of the Silurian hypothesis, the recently discovered Denisovans, the genuine puzzle of agriculture, the reality of Göbekli Tepe, a pattern begins to suggest itself, and the myths take on a different resonance. It becomes at least reasonable to wonder whether the near-universal memory of a lost age of greatness might be more than mere psychological projection. Whether, buried within the mythology, compressed and distorted by the passage of countless generations, there might be a genuine kernel, a real memory of a real world that was lost. We cannot prove it, but we can no longer easily dismiss it either. And this brings us to the grand unifying idea toward which our entire journey has been building. The Golden Age myths speak of a single lost age of greatness. But what if it was not a single age? What if the rise and fall has happened not once, but many times? What if human history is not a straight line, nor even a single rise and fall, but a great wheel turning through cycles of civilization and collapse again and again across the vast forgotten depths of time? We arrive now at the idea that gathers all the threads of our journey into a single sweeping vision. It is an idea both ancient and, in its implications, deeply modern. The idea that civilization is not a one-time event, a single climb from savagery to sophistication, but a recurring phenomenon. That civilizations rise and flourish and fall and are forgotten, and that out of the forgetting, new civilizations arise, believing themselves to be the first, only to rise and fall in their turn. The idea, in short, that human history moves not in a straight line, but in a great cycle, and that we are simply the latest turn of the wheel. We have encountered pieces of this idea throughout our exploration, and now it is time to assemble them into a whole. Recall what we have seen. We have seen that anatomically modern humans have existed for perhaps 200,000 years, and that recorded civilization occupies a mere 3% of that span, leaving a vast, dark ocean of time in which almost anything could have happened. We have seen, through the Silurian hypothesis, that even an advanced civilization could vanish so completely from the record that we might never detect it. We have seen, in the Denisovans, that entire branches of humanity can remain hidden from us until a chance discovery. We have seen, at Göbekli Tepe, that our confident assumptions about the capabilities of prehistoric people can be shattered by a single hilltop. We have heard in the myths of the Golden Age humanity's own insistent memory of a lost world of greatness. Now let us ask what happens if we take all of this seriously and follow it to its conclusion. The cyclical vision of history proposes something like the following. Imagine that at some point or points in the deep past, in the forgotten age, human beings rose to a level of sophistication, a form of civilization, whether modest or advanced, we cannot say, that flourished for a time. And then imagine that this world was destroyed, swept away by one of the great catastrophes that punctuate the history of our planet, the drowning of the coastlines at the end of the Ice Age, a cosmic impact, a climate convulsion, a reset of the kind we have explored. The civilization falls. Its cities, most likely built on the coasts and lowlands that were later drowned, are lost beneath the sea or buried by time. Its knowledge is scattered. The survivors, reduced to small bands of refugees, struggle to endure in a devastated world. And then, slowly, the world recovers. The survivors and their descendants gradually rebuild. But they have lost almost everything. The accumulated knowledge, the records, the sophistication are gone, carried away in the catastrophe and eroded by the generations of hardship that followed. What remains is fragmentary. A few practices half remembered, a few stories told and retold until they harden into myth, a vague and haunting sense that there was once a better time, a golden age now lost. And as this recovering humanity climbs slowly back toward civilization, it believes itself to be doing something entirely new. It has no memory of the world that came before. Only myths it does not recognize as history. It thinks it is the first. But it is not the first, it is the latest. This is the essential logic of the cyclical vision, and its most unsettling feature is precisely this, the way it would hide itself from us. For if this is truly how history works, then each civilization, including our own, would be systematically blind to the ones that came before. The catastrophe destroys the physical evidence, especially if the previous world's centers lay in regions now underwater or buried. The passage of time erodes whatever survives. The loss of records and writings severs the chain of memory, and the survivors' descendants, lacking any direct knowledge of the lost world, naturally assume that their own rise is the first and only rise. The cycle, in other words, is self-concealing. It erases the evidence of its own previous turns. And so each civilization gazes back into the past and sees, as we do, only a long, dark, apparently empty stretch of prehistory, never suspecting that the darkness might be full of the ruins of its predecessors. Notice how neatly this vision accounts for the very puzzles we have encountered. Why does agriculture appear so suddenly in multiple places, as if remembered? Because it was remembered, a fragment of lost knowledge resurfacing as humanity rebuilt. Why does every culture recall a lost golden age and divine teachers who brought the arts of civilization? Because there really was a former world, and its survivors really did carry fragments of knowledge to the recovering peoples. Why does the mathematics of deep time leave so vast a space unaccounted for? Because that space was not empty, but filled with risen and fallen worlds we cannot see. Why can we find so little trace of them? Because catastrophe and deep time, as the Silurian hypothesis showed us, erase the evidence with terrible efficiency. The cyclical vision in a single stroke offers an explanation for all of these mysteries at once. That is its seductive power. But we must, as we have throughout this journey, apply the discipline of honesty, and it cuts in more than one direction here. The cyclical vision is elegant, and it is emotionally compelling, and it accounts for many puzzles. But elegance and emotional appeal are not the same as proof, and we must be candid about the weaknesses as well as the strengths. The central and unavoidable weakness is the lack of direct, positive evidence. For all the suggestive puzzles and the humbling uncertainties, we do not actually possess the ruins of a lost pre-Ice Age civilization. We do not have its cities, its artifacts, its writings, verified and dated and undeniable. The case for the cycle is built largely on absence, on anomaly, and on inference. on what could have been erased, on what we cannot rule out, on puzzles that might have other explanations. And a case built on absence, however suggestive, can never carry the same weight as a case built on solid positive discovery. The mainstream explanations for each individual puzzle, the slow progress model for the long silence, climate and population pressure for agriculture, psychological projection for the Golden Age myths, remain serious, and collectively they may be entirely sufficient. It is possible that there was no cycle, that the deep past really was a long, slow beginning, and that the puzzles have mundane answers. There is also a real risk, which intellectual honesty compels us to name in the very elegance of the cyclical vision. A theory that explains everything, that can absorb every puzzle and account for every anomaly, must be watched with special care, because a theory that can explain any possible observation risks explaining nothing at all. The fact that the cyclical vision can account for the puzzles does not, by itself, prove that it is true. A sufficiently flexible story can always be made to fit. We must hold it, therefore, not as established fact, but as a hypothesis, a possibility, a lens through which to view the deep past, and no more than that. And yet, having said all of that, having given the skeptical position its full and honest due, we are left with something that will not quite go away, because the cyclical vision, whatever its lack of direct proof, has one great virtue. It takes seriously the genuine strangeness of our situation, the strangeness that the comfortable, conventional story tends to paper over. It takes seriously the 200,000 years of modern humanity and the mere 6,000 years of history. It takes seriously the humbling logic of deep time and erasure. It takes seriously Göbekli Tepe and the Denisovans and the sudden appearance of agriculture and the universal memory of a lost age. It refuses to simply assume that the deep past was empty. And in that refusal, it points toward a reframing of our entire self-understanding, a reframing so profound that it deserves to be stated plainly and confronted directly. It is the possibility that we, the proud inhabitants of the modern world, are not the beginning of the human story at all, that we are not the first to rise, that we are instead the recovery. We come now to the heart of it, to the single startling reframing toward which this entire journey has been building. It is an idea that, once you have truly considered it, is difficult to set aside. The idea that we, modern humanity, with all our science and our cities and our confident sense of being the pinnacle of the human story, are not the beginning at all, that we are the recovery, not the first civilization but the latest, not the opening chapter, but a rebuilding after a forgetting so deep that we no longer remember there was anything to forget. Let us state the case in its fullest and most compelling form, assembling everything we have gathered, and then let us weigh it honestly for what it is worth. The case begins with the mathematics, which is the unshakable foundation. Anatomically modern human beings, with brains and bodies identical to ours, have existed for something on the order of 200,000 years. Recorded civilization spans perhaps 6,000. This is not speculation, it is established fact, and it means that 97% of our existence as fully modern, fully intelligent beings lies before the beginning of history, in a vast darkness we can barely see into. That darkness is not a minor footnote to the human story. It is almost the entire human story. And the conventional claim that it was essentially uneventful, that for 190,000 years nothing of lasting consequence occurred, is, when you truly weigh it, an extraordinary claim in its own right. The case continues with the logic of erasure. established by the Silurian hypothesis. We have seen that even an advanced civilization existing in the deep past could vanish so completely from the record that we might never find it. We have seen that deep time and catastrophe erase evidence with terrible efficiency, that the fraction of the Earth's surface preserving any lasting trace is vanishingly small, and that the lands where ancient people would most likely have lived, the coasts and fertile lowlands, are precisely the lands most likely to have been drowned or buried. The absence of evidence for a forgotten civilization, therefore, cannot be taken as evidence of its absence. The silence proves nothing, because silence is exactly what erasure produces. The case draws strength from the Denisovans, who stand as living proof that entire branches of humanity, sophisticated and widespread, can remain utterly unknown to us until the chance discovery of a fragment of bone. If one whole people could hide in the shadows until 2010, then our confidence that we know the full cast of the deep past is clearly misplaced. The case is reinforced powerfully by Göbekli Tepe, which stands as undeniable mainstream accepted proof that our assumptions about the capabilities of prehistoric humans have been wrong, dramatically wrong, and that sophistication and monumental achievement existed thousands of years earlier than the conventional story allowed. Göbekli Tepe is the anchor, the hard evidence that the deep past held more than we believed, and that the experts have already been forced once to rewrite the beginning of the story. The case is deepened by the puzzle of agriculture, which appears suddenly across the world, in multiple independent centers, as if recovered rather than invented, and which, in its early stages, made human life harder rather than easier, as though people were returning to a known practice rather than freely choosing a new and burdensome one. And the case is crowned by the voice of humanity itself, speaking through the near-universal myths of a lost golden age and of divine teachers who brought the arts of civilization, humanity's own insistent worldwide memory that there was once a greater time, now fallen, and that the foundations of civilized life were not invented but received, handed down from some wiser source that came before. Assemble all of these, the mathematics, the logic of erasure, the Denisovans, Göbekli Tepe, the agricultural puzzle, the universal memory, and a single coherent reframing emerges. It is this. In the deep past, in the forgotten age, human beings rose towards sophistication, perhaps more than once. That world, or those worlds, flourished and were then destroyed by the catastrophes that punctuate our planet's history. Their remains lost beneath risen seas and the erasing weight of time. A remnant survived, carrying fragments of knowledge and a fading memory of what had been lost. And from that remnant, humanity slowly rebuilt, recovering old knowledge and mistaking it for new invention, preserving the memory of the lost world only in myth, and eventually rising again to us who look back and see only emptiness and believe ourselves to be the first. In this reframing, history is not a beginning, it is a recovery. We are not the architects of the first human civilization. We are the heirs of a forgotten one, rebuilding on foundations we cannot see and did not know were there. It is a breathtaking vision, and now we must weigh it with the honesty that has guided us throughout. Let us first acknowledge clearly the weakest points of the case, because they are real and they are serious. The greatest weakness, as we have said, is the absence of direct positive proof. We do not have the cities of the forgotten age. We do not have its verified artifacts, its dated ruins, its undeniable remains. The case is built on inference, on anomaly, on absence, on what could have been. rather than on what has been found and confirmed. A second weakness is that each individual piece of the case has a plausible mainstream explanation that requires no forgotten civilization at all. The long silence explained by the slow dynamics of small populations, agriculture by climate and necessity, the Golden Age myths by the human tendency to idealize the past. And a third is the seductive danger we named earlier, that a theory able to explain every puzzle may be too flexible to be trusted, fitting itself to any observation. An honest accounting must place these weaknesses squarely on the table. The case that we are the recovery is not proven. It cannot, on present evidence, be called established fact. It remains a hypothesis. But let us also acknowledge, with equal honesty, the strongest points of the case, because they too are real, and they are not so easily dismissed. The strongest point is that the case does not depend on any single dubious claim, but on a convergence of genuine, independent puzzles, each of which is real, even if each has a possible conventional answer. The mathematics is real. The logic of erasure is real and endorsed by serious scientists. The Denisovans are real. Göbekli Tepe is real, and it has already vindicated, once, the core intuition that we underestimate the deep past. The agricultural puzzle is real. The universal myths are real. It is one thing to explain away a single anomaly. It is another to be confronted with a whole constellation of them, all pointing, however tentatively, in the same direction. And the deepest strength of the case is that it takes seriously what the conventional story glosses over: the sheer, staggering strangeness of a species that possessed the full modern mind for 200,000 years and supposedly did almost nothing with it until the final 3%. So, where does this leave us, standing between the strong and the weak, between the compelling and the unproven? It leaves us, honestly, with a genuine and open uncertainty, which is itself a remarkable and humbling place to arrive. We cannot say on the evidence that we are certainly the recovery of a lost world, but neither can we say, with the easy confidence of the textbooks, that we are certainly the first, that the deep past was certainly empty, that nothing of consequence happened in those 190,000 years. The truth is that we do not know. The forgotten age remains genuinely forgotten, and the question of whether we are the beginning or the recovery remains genuinely, hauntingly open. And perhaps that uncertainty, rather than any firm answer, is the most important discovery of all, because it means that the story of who we are and where we come from is not the settled, finished tale we were taught. It is still being written. It is still being dug out of the earth and read from the depths of our genes and pieced together from the myths of our ancestors, and it may yet hold revelations that would transform our understanding of ourselves, which raises one final question, the question we must confront as our journey comes to its end. If we truly do not know our own origins, if the forgotten age still lies buried beneath us, then what exactly have we chosen to forget? And what might we still find if only we dared to look? We have come to the end of our journey through the forgotten age. We have traveled across 200,000 years of human existence, through the staggering mathematics of deep time, through the humbling logic of erasure, through the mystery of the Denisovans and the revelation of Göbekli Tepe, through the puzzle of agriculture and the universal memory of a lost golden age, all the way to the breathtaking possibility that we are not the beginning of the human story, but its recovery. And now, at the last, we must ask what all of it means. Why does it matter? Why should it trouble us or move us, whether we are the first civilization or the latest? It matters first because it strikes at the very core of how we understand ourselves. The story a civilization tells about its own origins is never merely a matter of academic curiosity. It shapes how that civilization sees its place in the world, its relationship to time, its sense of what is possible and what is permanent. We have told ourselves a particular story, that we are the summit of an unbroken ascent, the triumphant culmination of a single steady climb from the caves to the stars. It is a story of progress, of confidence, of arrival. And it carries beneath its surface a quiet assumption of permanence, the sense that having climbed so high, we are surely here to stay. But if the forgotten age is real, if we are the recovery rather than the beginning, then that story and that assumption must change. For it would mean that we are not unique, not the first, not the inevitable summit of anything. It would mean that others rose before us, believing as we believe in their own permanence, and that they fell and were forgotten so completely that their heirs, ourselves, do not even remember they existed. And it would mean that what happened to them could happen to us, that we too could fall and be forgotten and become nothing more than a blank stretch of time in the record of some future civilization that believes itself to be the first. The question of our origins, in other words, is also a question about our destiny. It matters, second, because of how much still lies genuinely unknown, waiting beneath our feet and beyond our sight. Consider how much of the relevant evidence has never been examined. The continental shelves, the drowned coastlines where ancient humans would most likely have gathered and lived, remain almost entirely unexplored by archaeologists, lying beneath the waves, buried in sediment, scarcely touched. Vast regions of the world's landmass have never been systematically excavated. Sites like Göbekli Tepe, we must remember, remain only partly dug, with much of the complex and of others like it still sleeping underground. And even what has been found is not always fully understood, for our interpretations are shaped by the assumptions we bring, and evidence that does not fit the expected story can be set aside, undated, unrecognized, or unexplored. In other words, the forgotten age is not forgotten because we have searched for it exhaustively and found nothing. It is forgotten in part because we have scarcely searched at all, and because the places most likely to hold answers are the hardest for us to reach, drowned, buried, or lying beneath the assumptions we have not thought to question. The blankness of the deep past may be, to a significant degree, a blankness of our own looking, not necessarily of what is truly there. And this should fill us not with false certainty in either direction, but with a profound humility and a profound curiosity. For that, in the end, is perhaps the deepest lesson of the forgotten age. Not that we know we are the recovery of a lost world, for we do not know that. And not that we can be sure we are the first, for we cannot be sure of that either. The deepest lesson is humility, the recognition that we do not fully know our own origins, that the story of humanity is far longer, far stranger, and far more mysterious than the tidy version we were taught. That beneath the 6,000 years of history lies a vast ocean of time, 200,000 years deep, of which we can see only the surface, and that we do not truly know what lies in its depths. We are a species with a curious relationship to our own past. We are capable of extraordinary knowledge, of reading the age of rocks and the sequence of genes, of reconstructing lost languages and vanished climates. And yet we remain, in the most fundamental sense, strangers to ourselves, uncertain of where we came from, of how long the human story truly is, of how many times our ancestors may have risen and fallen before the version of us that finally wrote it down. We have, in a very real sense, forgotten most of our own existence. And whether that forgetting is simply the natural erasure of deep time, or whether it conceals something more, a lost age of greatness, a former world, a truth we have not yet dared to uncover, remains one of the great open questions of our existence. The ancients told us in their myths that there was once a golden age and that we have fallen from it. Modern science tells us in its mathematics that we have existed fully formed for 200,000 years and can account for only the last 3%. Perhaps these two statements, the ancient myth and the modern measurement, are pointing from opposite directions toward the same forgotten truth, or perhaps they are not. We do not yet know. But the mere fact that we cannot rule it out, that the question remains genuinely, hauntingly open, should be enough to change forever the way we look at the deep and silent past. The forgotten age is still out there. It lies beneath the risen seas and under the unexcavated earth, and within the myths we have not learned to read, and perhaps in the very genes we carry without understanding. It is waiting, as it has waited for 100,000 years and more, for us to learn how to look and to find the courage to see what we may have chosen long ago to forget. What do you believe? Are we the first civilization to reach these heights, or only the latest to rise from a forgetting we cannot remember? And what do you think still lies buried out there in the deep past, waiting to be found? Tell us in the comments. If this journey changed the way you see the human story and our place within it, leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more.